Welcome back to the Somatic Enneagram podcast. This is part 2 of Unlocking Inner Healing. We're so thankful for the ways in which you are sharing and helping to grow this podcast. If you know of someone who is interested in doing more of this work, you can learn more about the modules that Marianne Gilbert leads by going to www.somaticenneagram.com. And so, here's part 2.
So I'm curious how you see this work as different from trauma therapy or somatic experiencing or other work people might be seeking out in their healing. When is somatic Enneagram work really what's called for?
Yeah, there is a lot of difference. Of course, I am trained in both. However, I have never certified, with the SC work, but I encountered it in the early days when Peter Levine was, basically teaching out of the living rooms of Berkeley before his book came out and before his school was there. So I had the privilege of being in his personal trainings at that time. And I know now it has a whole school that is training people to become trauma therapists. So I want to make a distinction here that it's not my intention to actually do trauma therapy. I'm working with normal, human development and influences in the way that we develop according to not only, our nervous system, but also developmental stages. And that living on this planet Earth, we are confronted with overwhelming impact and experiences that are usually temporary. And, they will trigger the fight, flight, and freeze reactions as fast as they can in order to help you save, yourself from any kind of danger of losing your life or the need to survive good enough so that you can continue your life and return to functioning. Yeah, so that's normal human development. And it's normal human development via the Enneagram where we are recognizing patterns of behavior that our cognitive mind has and our heart and our body have understood that to be a certain identification with who am I in the middle of this world and how do I express myself and what is creating these patterns inside of me. And that's where the Enneagram comes in, to be able to discern that. So the marriage between the principles of trauma resolution therapy and applying it to normal human developmental ways in which we survived good enough, but sacrificed a little bit of our free-flowing life force every time that happened, which is a part of our human condition as we are growing up. So having said that, and then that is a certain part of psychology and neurobiology and a little bit of neuroscience that comes into that because we are working with the Somatic Enneagram. So to highlight the somatic structure that has to do with the defense system that is actually creating the fuel for the patterns is what we're teaching, and how to relax the patterns by using body intelligence to relax the type structure is what we are doing. And the method that I'm using is a combination of using the trauma resolution principles as well as somatic awareness practices that I have studied with other people like Kathy Kane, who is an orthobionomist who did a lot of work with Peter Levine, and I did quite a bit of continuing ed with her. The craniosacral work has a lot of different processes that are somatic and emotional release methods. I have done some martial arts, some meditation practices, myofascial release. I've done Gestalt, and I've also done constellation work. So what you get is a plethora of experience that I've delved into over my life. And integrated it into the question, what is it that makes us human? And what creates our perception of reality through that human developmental patterning that seems to create a certain amount of identity that we become attached to and we refer to as this is who I am. And according to the Enneagram, with its cosmology, that says we are more than that. We are actually in a state of self forgetting, and we are needing to remember ourselves. Is bringing in more the essential nature and the spiritual nature of our human journey that naturally arises when these patterns and the way that we are operating through our defense system, cutting off aspects of reality that we believe we cannot tolerate, and therefore seeing only a small portion of reality. And that's what we become patterned to perceive and to receive as a habit. And that habit is what we call conditioned reality. That is a partial view of the reality as it actually is.
I appreciate the distinction because what I see and have experienced myself is when I'm engaging in this spiritual development work, it's very uncomfortable for my ego that is used to identifying with myself in a certain way as somebody that I've been conditioned to see myself as. I've experienced what I think prematurely often gets talked about as a trauma response, but it's what you're saying, it's the body's natural intelligence that it has kept it from me until I'm ready to be able to tolerate it. And that's what loosening the type structure helps with. So I think specifically, we talk a lot about generational differences and language differences. We often will say trauma when really it's about learning to tolerate something that was a bit intense, but wasn't prolonged traumatic experience. And the same principles apply to the spiritual development, that it might be uncomfortable in the body, but it's not that all overwhelm is the same level. And so I see you working really specifically and teaching us to work really specifically with that overwhelm that is still grounded. They can still, somebody isn't going to go back to that experience because they have enough resource in them. Is that what kind of what how you see
Yeah,
it?
you need to understand that these adaptive strategies that we recognize in the Enneagram are actually ways in which your intrinsic defense system, is oriented to save you from these very difficult situations. And we do, hold hostage certain charges in our bodies, from these experiences. And they weren't ultimately because of the somatically and cellular way in which the organization of the defense system goes around the overwhelm so that it won't really destruct or destroy your nervous system, right? That is important for you to recognize, that is a normal, functional way in which humans become human beings who are conditioned, but alive and good enough alive with a good enough ego. And they're just going through their lives and their development without having a great functional distress. See, trauma as a diagnosis is more PTSD, which is a post-traumatic stress disorder, right? And they have all other words now for it. But what that means is that an aspect of the trauma that did not get metabolized destroyed a normal functioning nervous system so that you cannot go out in the world and function. Yeah. So that's when somebody is needing to go to a trauma therapist. Yeah. And they are specifically doing this work through trauma. And I took the principles and they say, well, as a matter of fact, this is happening in a small way in normal functioning human beings. And we can apply these principles of going to the felt sense, contraction in the body, and learning how to make space for it by checking the body signals when you get closer to that part that doesn't feel so good inside, that feels tight and constricted. And it makes you feel like you can take a deep breath once you place your attention there. So, what the trauma resolution principles say if the breathing rhythm and the temperature and the sensation of your skin and your heart rate are getting overwhelmed, yeah, by these aspects of your body beginning to dysregulate, this is pointing to you getting closer to a contained, overwhelming energy that you've held in your body, away from it causing a pattern of survival that is creating dysfunction. It isn't. Yeah, so the adaptive strategies are not for nothing called adaptive. They're talking in this world about either them being adaptive, meaning the adaptation gives you a new way to regroup and to be resilient and go on with your life and function. Yeah. But then you have the maladaptive strategies as well. Like, for instance, oh, I had a very bad experience with somebody and they hurt my feelings. And I go inside of my house and I eat ice cream for 3 or 4 days. And then I come back out. That's a maladaptive strategy. Yeah, because it doesn't make you feel better. And yet somehow through the time, the body kind of regulates itself good enough and goes back into the world, being informed by the overwhelm, but not being taken into a level of dysfunction. Does that make sense? As a
Yeah.
And of course, there's overlap. We cannot avoid that. But I like to stay on this side. And when something happens in the facilitation that we do with learning how to work with that constriction by shifting your attention to a part of your body that's already open and understanding that energy follows the attention. And as the inner observer attention stays with what's already open, the brain receives, oh, she's alive, she survived, and the nervous system begins to regulate. Yeah, so for healthy enough egos and healthy enough beings that are functioning in the world, that is a very doable um, situation, yeah, to work with. Not when people have sustained complex trauma or PTSD of something that was, creating a lot of difficulty in their lives.
Yeah, and I think that's what I've found so powerful about the Enneagram at first, and then specifically this work, is that it's really going deeper and deeper slowly by building the resilience to know I actually am starting to feel uncomfortable. I have a cellular memory coming up, but I know I can handle it and be with it. And especially when I'm being facilitated or in a group setting where we're all engaging with this work, it can bring up very intense things, but not to the point where it's sending us back into total overwhelm. It's finding that edge. And I think that's what's so powerful about it is that you don't have to have identified trauma in your life. And in fact, it's great if you are going about your life well enough, but can tell that there's something missing or there's some places you just can't seem to go, but not to the point where you need that deeper trauma therapy.
I know recently you spoke on a panel at one of the IEA Egypt conferences about trauma in the Enneagram. So I'm just curious how you see trauma and the Enneagram, where they come together, where they should be separate, how that's all working.
Yeah, it was actually very a good experience to be on the panel. It was 4 people. and it was a multicultural panel. And, in the panel was asking me, how would you combine the Enneagram with trauma? And I said, well, if you ask it that way, I wouldn't. To me, trauma therapy is something that is its own therapeutic application that I believe doesn't really jive very well with the Enneagram world. And that's what the Enneagram is attempting to do as a movement or a system is to help people understand themselves and others better. And also to help them with their evolution towards more an essential or divine spiritual nature, which is, of course, another aspect of it. So if you look at that, then I believe that bringing trauma in with the Enneagram as we know it as a system, I believe it's going to confuse it. And we're going to maybe see people who are trauma therapy patients maybe showing up in a completely different type than what they actually are. Yeah, because
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
reaction, right? As a normal situations. So they need to first get back to an good enough self regulation in the nervous system for them to go down deeper consciously with an inner observer that is not hijacked by the fight, flight, and freeze, as a constant interference. So if you say that trauma needs to be connected with that, I would say no. If you work with the Enneagram and you use the principles of trauma resolution with somebody who gets activated and you have trouble, resourcing them and bringing them back to a state of self regulation and teaching them not to go into these places on their own and seek another practitioner if they feel they have an after reaction to the particular session that they have had. And you need to have either the recognition, the ability to recognize when somebody has gone not just into overwhelm, but in a re-traumatization reaction. Yeah. And I hope that I will be clear enough in teaching this, not in module 1, not in module 2, not in module 3 even. We started at module 4 and 5. And I only certify people to start working with clients, coaching clients, teachers, seasoned teachers of the Enneagram who already have ability to recognize, that something is different here that requires a different attention.
Yeah, I find the work is so healing to the nervous system, but the way you're teaching it and the way we're holding it is not designed to heal the nervous systems that need the most attention. And that's where I find many of my clients are therapists or healers or who have done a lot of baseline work before they're ready to do this more spiritual development that's going to bring up things that requires them to be able to hold a lot more in their system than they could have even a few years ago sometimes.
It's the younger Enneagram enthusiasts that are now flooding into the system. Yeah, this is a different developmental group of people that, are needing something more specific that is accurate for their developmental level.
Right. So I love how you're clearing up this languaging because I think a lot of younger people have a lot of language, but in terms of that inner observer awareness to know, even again for myself, to know when I'm just a bit overwhelmed versus when it feels totally unmanageable and I need to seek that external support, learning that distinction is the work. And that's why, having Aaron and I have been with you now about at least 3 years, and it's starting to come together. Okay, here's how I see that in myself. Here's how I see more of what's going on in my clients. But to really have worked with you for so long is it's fascinating how this work comes together over time.
Yeah. And so for me, it's very important that this word trauma doesn't get confused, because now it has become sort of a term that everybody uses. Oh, yeah, I had this trauma. And I say, well, is the trauma still here? No, I survived it, but I'm working with my trauma. I said, is that what is necessary right now? I mean, is what makes you think you have to work with your trauma? What is happening right now in you? Yeah, because the trauma might not actually be ready to be worked with. Just because you know you have had trauma, or your perception is that you had trauma, doesn't necessarily mean that you are not functioning correctly and your ego and your adaptive strategies are good enough, to keep you going. So if you engage with this work that I'm teaching at a time where you feel that your life is actually going good enough, right? Then, this work is probably not for you at this point. You can take the classes for your own curiosity and kind of work with whatever is there. But I find that people really start working with this if they have come up against something that is, too big for them. It's too difficult, and they are starting to show signs of, cannot function in the world. I need something to change and to happen, and I don't know where to go. So if you go to the Somatic Enneagram and you're working with some of this self-regulation, grounding practices, resourcing, and that can help everybody feel better. But in this work that I teach, that is only the beginning to create the space and the capacity within yourself to then work with what has been separated out, contained, and, is out of sight. And if you
Right.
do work prematurely, it's not going to be helpful.
So there has to be enough awareness of the pattern. I think this is why it's so helpful when people have really worked with their Enneagram patterning before, where they see it, but they're enough bumping up against their limits that they need support, but they're not in so much overwhelm that they can't have awareness. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
Yeah. So that's why I say the Somatic Enneagram brings you to an unpopular proposition. And if you're not ready to go there, you simply won't. Okay? You can kind of try to find it mechanically, and you can do the process mechanically, but that particular part is kind of staying behind on purpose, because it may feel that you need to have some more life experience before it's going to show itself. And you can't force it. It may also depend on your soul development. Yeah. So whatever is happening in you, that's current in you and where you are at, and that is the art of doing that somatic awareness practice within yourself and learning how to begin to wake up to the parts of yourself that are dormant, and you can kind of go closer to them and resource yourself and ground yourself, and know that what you're doing is sharpening all the foundational elements that are necessary for preparing yourself for when the time is ripe to go to a place or not.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Somatic Enneagram podcast. You can learn more about Marianne Gilbert, her teachings, and sign up for her training modules by visiting mariannegilbert.com or somaticenneagram.com. The Somatic Enneagram podcast co-hosts Karen Burley and Aaron Maines are both trained in the Marianne Gilbert method and work with clients in person and online. Head to the show notes to learn more. Help us grow this podcast by subscribing, leaving a review, and please share it with your friends. Until next time.